As Katie mentioned, I'm Renee Bovee, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Wyoming State Teacher, and I'm also the Program Manager for the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund. I've been in the grant making business for, I hate to say it, over 30 years now. So as Katie mentioned, she's going to monitor the chat feature, and we'll have time for questions as we go through this session, and then of course at the end. So to go ahead and get started, grant writing is a generic term. This is a brief introduction to grant writing proposals and foundation requests. Most grant applications, most programs have a very specific process. This presentation is going to focus, and you're going to hate this analogy, at the 1-inch level, not the 10,000-foot level, and not specific to the how-to on a specific grant application, like a CLG grant or a Cultural Trust Fund grant. That's for later, our next session. Rather, I'm going to focus on the premise and the backbone of what grant applications are as tools and what they are hoping to achieve for both the applicant organization and the granting organization. As you can see, if you want more information on how to find grants, I'm going to give you only one recommendation. It's called the Foundation Directory Online. This service is available free of charge from the Wyoming State Library. Do not fall for those online solicitations to help you find government grants or funding. They're essentially going to charge you for the government information, which is available free of charge through the Foundation Directory Online. That's your only warning. So I'm going to talk about the basic premise behind the process. And there's 3 components. Today, I'm going to go over the 3 interrelated topics: the grant application, project management, and grants management. Almost all grant applications are built around the basic premise of who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much. I will walk you through these concepts in the first section of the presentation. But grant applications are only the first step in a process. I need to bring in the associated project management and grants management, because those components impact not only how you actually apply for a grant, but how you then report and document your grant-supported activity. Grant applications are not a standalone effort, and it is part of an integrated system. The grant application. As we look at the basics of a grant application, I'm going to default to your organization as a certified local government entity. If we have someone here who is not affiliated with a CLG board or commission, some information I am providing you today will have to be tweaked, but we can answer those questions later on as needed. Before you begin any grant application, do your homework. I am taking you back to elementary school. Read the guidelines, read the instructions, and note the language being used in the application material from the granting organization. The language that the granting organization uses is a key indicator of what they're interested in supporting, and it will definitely tell you what they are not interested in supporting. There are often categories within the guidelines or within the application, complete this section, do this section, whatever. And the terms that are used to designate those sections can create a shortcut for you when you actually start writing a grant application. It can give you an outline to fill in, basically. Guidelines are crucial as they will help you determine if your project actually qualifies and that your organization qualifies as an applicant. And why go through the physical and mental work of putting together a grant application only to find you don't qualify? Timelines for grant applications are also provided in the guidelines and in the application processes. Be sure to meet those due dates or project start and end dates. If you don't, your application is going to be disqualified right off the bat. So the first section, who? So who are you? Who is involved? Who has authority? Who is the contact? Most grant applications have a specific section where organizational applicant information is required. Be sure to complete the information with accurate, or that section with accurate information. And whomever is designated as contact on this grant and on this project, make sure they're aware of that and they're involved in the grant. Believe it or not, people get assigned and they're going, I don't know anything. So why do some granting organizations ask for a second contact? One reason is because of the separation of project oversight and fiscal oversight. What's happening in the project and how the money is being tracked. And another reason is, and I'm almost ashamed to say this, but who do we call when you get run over by the Mack truck? And I'm only being slightly humorous here because I have had to deal with organizations with grants when their sole contact person, the one who knew what everything is and where everything is and who's doing what to whom, died. It's not fun for anyone. What is your project? What can be one of the hardest sections to write? But you must be focused and concise. Granting organizations are very busy, and grant reviewers and decision makers are looking at many applications in any grant cycle. 90% of the time, do not write in academic jargon or field jargon. You need to be as straightforward and upfront with your request as possible. Now, there's one exception, two exceptions on this, and that's if you're going for something collegiate, academic grant, or if you're sending information up for a direct appeal to a federal granting program. Then your language is going to change and you're going to get much more academic. But I'm not going to talk about that one. That's a totally different subject out there when you're going after federal dollars or academic dollars. The best advice for you when you start trying to figure out how to write about what your project is and what you're going to come into to the CLG program for, or to the Cultural Trust Fund to, or to, how do you get yourself started writing this? And that's write the first sentence. And the first sentence is in one sentence. You want to specifically state exactly what you want grant dollars for. And for example, I'm going to make this generic, but for example, We are requesting $5,000 in grant funding to hire a contractor, Jane Smith, to document and prepare a National Register nomination for the XYZ historic building in the commercial district of downtown Anytown, Wyoming. Then you go on to explain. Okay? If you can write that first sentence, you are, I would say, 70% done with this section. Now you're just going to start going into the details. When? Who? What? When? When will this project, activity, event happen? Grant programs have specific timelines involved. When you apply, when the grant funds must be used, and when your projects must end. You have to know these timelines to be sure that your proposed grant activity fits those timelines. If the grant that you're going after allows you to apply on this date, but you must end 12 months, 14 months, 6 months after the start date, your project has to fit within that timeline. Now, not all grants have the ability, or all granting organizations have the ability to extend a grant. So never assume you can get one of those. They're actually quite rare. If your project cannot be fully completed within the time frame of the grant that you are going after, you might be able to break it into what are called phases. Now, not all grants can accommodate phase requests. A lot of them will. But a phase request is a discrete series or activity that occurs within the time frame and is discrete to the dollars that are being represented in the grant application, both the request and any required match. So let me give you an example. You are working on the restoration of a historic building. That could be a multi-million-dollar project, and it takes 5 or 6 years to do. But you have an opportunity to come in for a grant for $20,000 for this time frame. So what of that restoration, rehabilitation of the building fits? Maybe it's just doing 2 windows. We're doing the front 2 windows, and that's what you come in for. In your narrative, you talk about what's happening before and what's going to happen afterwards briefly. You have to give the context of why you're just coming in for 2 windows. But that application is focused really tight. Okay? Where? Isn't it obvious, Renee? We're the Sheridan Historic Preservation Office. This is board. We're doing this in Sheridan. Yes and no. Are you actually doing it in Sheridan, or are you doing it elsewhere in the county? And if you're talking about doing something specific to a specific site or a specific building, you have to get into the weeds on this. You have to give us street addresses. You have to give us directions. You have to explain that this is deep in the woods, that this is on private property, or this is on governmental land, or all the details that you can give us. And the reason for that is, again, twofold. One, the granting organization might have an area of service, i.e., they can only give grants in Fremont County, at which point Sheridan County, no, we're not going to help you. But it's also very important when it gets down to what is actually being done to that site or building. And does that information need to be protected, i.e., if it's an archaeological site? So all that detail is important, and it needs to be explained in the application process. You might think that this is a site, it's up this creek, we can get there from this road to this road, it's a 10-minute walk in. But do you know if that's on private land? Is that on state lands? Is it on federal lands? Who else might need to be involved in this project? So where is very important. And please don't assume knowledge. We love you all dearly when we're in the Wyoming SHPO office or the Cultural Trust Fund. And I know a lot of you, and you're explaining detail to me. But when it comes in on an application, a lot of other people start looking at that information and they won't know you. They won't know what you're doing, and they won't know your site. So detail is important. I should say that throughout all of this. Detail is important. Okay, here's a section. Why? Why are you doing this project? Why are you even bothering to spend the several hours preparing a grant application, not to mention potentially many years in getting a project completed? Why should the granting organization care? And why does your community care? Some of the specifics in why are you doing this project? Why are you doing it this way? Why are you using this contractor or this service? Why now? Is there a crisis which needs to be addressed? Oh, there was a fire. Or why hasn't this already been done? We didn't have the resources. We now have the resources. What has changed? But that's part of why. How? How is crucial, folks. You're in historic preservation. You should know this one. How will this work be accomplished? Is how something is done is crucial to the integrity of a site or of a building. If you're in a historic preservation rehabilitation of an old building, you need to be aware of what you can and cannot do and what you may face inside the building. So for example, you're working on the restoration of a building and the structure needs to have old paint removed. Sounds simple, but you can't sandblast it. What if it's lead paint? What if there are other contaminants under that paint that you might reach, i.e. asbestos? How is important when you're working with the contractors to do the work that you're asking the grant dollars to help you with? Does the work require specialized knowledge, expertise, or skills in a certain area? Does the work require familiarity with the community? If it's, let's say it's something more like a public outreach activity. How can be crucial in finding qualified people to do the work. It can be important because of community expectations. Maybe you think that old faded out mural on that wall doesn't have any meaning until you try and start taking it down and everyone in the neighborhood comes and knocks on your door and says, stop. How can also be very important because of legal boundaries or constraints. For example, if you're on a site that is multiple governmental jurisdictions, how something is done becomes very important as well, just because of who has to do what, where, and in the process. How much? Oh, golly gee, that's why we're writing a grant. We need money. It is the money. And money is not free. Money has more rules, regulations, and laws than essentially anything else out there. Granting organizations, the ones that you're applying to, want budgets which are as accurate as possible. Grant organizations understand that grant applications are proposals. Thus, budgets are estimates. But grant organizations want you, the applicant, to do the homework, to get bids, to do the research on similar costs or similar projects, so that you have a budget that is as accurate as possible. And by the way, please don't pad your budget. We can tell. Yes, some grant programs may not fully fund your project, and you end up with a partial grant award. But it does not help when you inflate costs just to create a safety margin on your application. Padding doesn't help anyone. In the case of WYSHPO, the CLG grants, we rarely give a partial award, extremely rarely. And we talk to you well beforehand if we're going to have to do it. And when we say, or you say you need $10,000 and we award you $10,000, if you don't spend $10,000, you won't believe the number of gray hairs Renee gets. It's very hard for us to re-grant money out. Be aware that certain grants, particularly federal grants, of which CLG grants are federal grants, you absolutely cannot have contingency funding in your budget, period. If it shows up, the National Park Service will require that it be removed from the budgets that are presented. You can have them in your project, you just can't have them in your request. That's a federal rule. It's a big federal no-no. No contingency funding. So I just blew through who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much. In the grant application, they might be called slightly different things. What becomes describe your project. When does your project start? When does your project end? How much? It's called an expense page, a revenue page. How? That's part of the descriptives that we'll force you into. How is this being done? Who's doing it? Who's providing the oversight? And that kind of leads me into my next section. So before we get there, does anyone have any questions so far? Katie?
I haven't seen any in the chat so far, but please feel free at this point to type something in. I think you can also unmute yourself and ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll take a couple minutes to wait and see if anyone has anything.
All right. It's crickets.
You've given them so much already.
All right. Next section then. This is an interrelated section called project management. Why am I talking about something outside of the grant application? The reason why is that project management and the following section, grants management, are crucial to the success of grant-supported projects. Granting organizations, WYSHPO, the Cultural Trust Fund, want to see you be as successful as possible with your projects. And successful does not mean just completing the project, but completing it in a way that does not cause legal or financial auditing problems, and hopefully does not cause financial damage to your organization or cause burnout or somebody going insane with frustration with the people dedicating their time to the project. Project management is also a capacity issue for your organization. Depending upon your grant project, you may or may not have enough resources, primarily people and time, to manage the project. So you have to be aware of what is involved in the project and what your organization can take on and what you might have to give to somebody else to take on. Project management encompasses several different sections. When I started this presentation, I kind of mentioned this was going to be a backbone level. Let me change my analogy a little bit. If the grant application is the backbone, let's call project management the muscles of the project. When you write a grant application, there is a presumption that the specific project or activity which is going to be done is beyond your organization's normal resources. Why else would you be writing a grant to get the money for it? Thus, within your organization and consequently reflected in your application has to be the recognition and commitment of resources to the oversight of the actual project. In the grant application, I mentioned the need for approvals for the grant application process, but there are also approvals and modification responsibilities at the project management level, which is totally different and needs to be prepared for. So, what is your project? Is your project to request funds to get a National Register nomination done? Are you holding community meetings because you're working on a strategic plan? Is your project the fact that you're finally going to try and save that historic building and you're going to start working on it? You need to know not only what the project is, but who has oversight of the project. And I'm not talking the grant and I'm not talking financial at this point. Who's going to be coordinating this? Who has the understanding of the mechanisms that you can get expenses paid? The money side, this really does overlap with the grants management, but it's also somewhat standalone because of matching funds that come into a project. The project itself, who needs to approve the project? Who is making ongoing decisions on the project? If the project is something that requires a city or county process to kick in, for example, procurement, or the regulations that are part of the Secretary of the Interior standards, or a NEPA, environmental worksheet, evaluation. Who is doing this? Who has to approve it? Who has to make sure this gets done? Who can make changes on a project? If something starts, you're working in a historic building and everyone has heard this. As soon as you open a wall, you have a whole new series of problems to start dealing with. And I know the architects out there will tell me, no, that's not true, Renee. Architects try and take that into consideration, but there are always changes that happen in life. So who needs to make the changes on the project? Who needs to change the scope? Who needs to approve changes? If responsibilities have changed, do you need to pay that contractor more money? And please note, red, remember, as a grantee, you must notify the granting program for possible change approval or how to solve a problem options. Don't just assume that you guys can go from this type of repair to that type of repair, or this type of programming to that type of programming without having a conversation with the organization that's giving you the money. Because maybe that's something that we can't support. Record keeping and documentation. Who is keeping the books on the project is the simple one. But I'm not talking about just the accounting. Without good documentation, you're going to have a devil of a time getting grant payments or closing out the grant, completing final reports. Responsibilities for obtaining and maintaining documentation need to be assigned within your organization, and oversight needs to be done to assure those activities that have been assigned are being completed. There is an axiom about it takes a village. Most projects requiring grant support involve many different people in many different roles to ensure a project is successful. No one or two people should be expected to take on all aspects of the project. If that happens, they need to be recognized as relatives of Superman. So within your organization, within your capacity for doing the project that you are proposing to do, who is responsible for keeping the notes, for taking photos, for providing information to the public, for providing documentation appropriate to the appropriate authorities? For example, if you want to try and get a payment and the city tells you I need an invoice, who's going to get the invoice? If you are dealing with something that needs to be recorded with cultural records in Laramie, who is responsible for getting it into WYSHPO? These assignments need to be made. Evaluation. Evaluation is not something you do at the end of the project. Okay? Evaluation must occur throughout the entire project so that you can evaluate not only whether the project was successful, but how well you handled the challenges and opportunities which arose within the project. And finally, with evaluation, you can decide if you ever want to do this project again. Oh, and yes, evaluations are part and parcel of almost any grant, and evaluation reports should be part of any final report. So when I talked before about oversight and approvals and modifications and assigning people to this. Who do you need to assign? Who's going to do some of this? What is the evaluation process? What if changes are occurring? Why are they occurring? What has changed in the process? What has changed in the project? Is that being documented? What is working right now? What is not working? How successful were you? Who participated? Did you follow all the processes and procedures? Did you miss a step and have to go back and correct something? Document it so you know, so you can do better next time. If you've been evaluating and documenting throughout the entire project, you can then better handle the crisis. You can usually start seeing that a crisis is going to build on you because you can see what's starting to fail or what's not being handled correctly. If you've documented it, you can get on it sooner, and maybe the crisis becomes a glitch. I've talked about doing an evaluation process, but what is the evaluation process? And you actually kind of have to figure this out pretty early in the game, because when you write the grant application, part of the how and the why is the evaluation. Who's documenting the stuff? I've already mentioned that. Who's writing out the evaluation reports? There's got to be a summary somewhere, so the next person down the road knows what worked and what didn't work. Whoops, sorry. My scrolled too fast. Sorry about that. All right. So, one of the points I kind of wanted to bring up is there are things outside of your control on any project. And I'm going to bring up something we all just went through not too long ago. It should still be relatively fresh in our minds. COVID. No one anticipated COVID. And no one anticipated the failure of the supply chain with the aftermath of COVID. So obviously, those are things that you can't see coming down the road. But if you have some of the processes done, you've done the documentation, you have people in control, you know who's making decisions, and you're talking to your granting organization, then you can adapt. Now, something like COVID was nationwide. It affected everyone, everywhere, and there were a lot of things that were put in place. And by the way, that was the first time in CLG grant history that we were able to do extensions. And it was because of COVID that the CLG grant timeline expanded. And a lot of times you're not restricted to 12 or 14 months to the project now. Now you might have 2 years or more on a project. So some things are good after the fact. So that's the conclusion for project management. Does anyone have any questions at this time?
Nothing has been left in the chat so far, but we can still take a minute or two to see if anyone has questions. Otherwise, we can move along.
You know, someday I'm actually going to get a recording of crickets. All right. No questions at this point. I'm going to go on to the third leg. Grants management. I'll now term this component the nervous system. If something goes wrong in this process, you may end up with a wonderful project but the stomach ulcers going along with the project will have repercussions through the remainder of the grant process. Let's recognize that those of you participating today in this presentation are affiliated with a local government, city, town, or county. There are certain parts of the grant-making process which are not in your control. You must work with the contracting and accounting processes that are part of your local government, and you must be aware of their restraints, their rules, their procedures, and their timelines. A city, county government grants manager can and should be your new best friend. When you apply for a grant, whether you're coming in to WYSHPO office, or whether you're coming in to the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, or you're going to XYZ Foundation, the money is going to go through your legal organization, which is the city or county government. So you must work with them. Contracting. You want to hire a contractor to do a National Register nomination. Because the city and the county is responsible for making the money flow to go out to pay a contractor, you need to know what rules they may have in that establishment of the contract. We use the phrase contractor, but if there's a legal contract, there is a process that you will have to go through. Procurement rules. The state of Wyoming, we defer down to what your city or county governments require. There are certain federal requirements that come in on you. For example, finding a contractor who might be SOI, Secretary of the Interior qualified. There are certain federal rules that are incorporated in the contract you receive from the WYSHPO office that have requirements about non-discrimination, equal opportunities. These are rules, these are processes that will have to be followed. Realize WYSHPO, we allow our certified local governments, organizations, in your grant application to come to us and say, we already know who we want to bring in. It's called a sole source. And we will allow you to do a sole source, but you have to explain to us why you're using this person, and you have to provide the documentation that they're qualified to do the work that's being proposed. Financial accounting and revenues. Specific to the certified local government grants, CLG grant dollars go into the coffers of the city or the county. They do not go into your organization's wallet. You may have to work with an accounting system that is also within your board. I know there's a handful of you out there that have a separate bank account system. For those of you that have that separate bank account system, there is essentially a two-book system that's going on, and they have to play well together. So I'm not going to get too far into the two-book system. Just understand that the Grant dollars are going through the city or county government. The match might be going through that separate set of books, but the information has to be shared. Depending upon how you're working, the financial accounting is both revenues and expenses. We tend to hyper focus on the expense side, but the match is your revenue side. So you have to understand how match works. Different grant processes have different match requirements. So since I've been talking about CLGs and the Cultural Trust Fund, let me give you the first one right off the bat. When you request funding through the CLG grant program, you're requiring 60% funding from the federal grant dollars and 40% as match. When you come to the Cultural Trust Fund, you can only request 50% of the project cost from the Cultural Trust Fund and 50% match. You need to know how these two can work together, and they can. That's one of the advantages. That's one of the reasons you're familiar when I talk about the Cultural Trust Fund and CLGs, because we can match each other and we can work together really, really well. But you have to understand there are differences between us. If you are going after funds outside of these two entities that we're most familiar with, let's say you went to the local Smith Foundation because they're supporting activity in your community, you have to understand how that money has to be brought into the system and how that money has to then be documented and maintained and how it can all work together. In the normal process, you are going to be working with a grants manager and probably a separate city or county accounting person, and an accounting manager or somebody who's been assigned to this. A grants manager is going to help keep track of the overall flow of financial information, contracting information. But the weeds are handled by that accounting person. You need to check for Jane Smith? Give me your invoice. I'll get you your check. You'll see it in 2 weeks. Okay. And by the way, you need to learn how long it takes to actually get a check out of government. Oh, I'm sorry. When I use my scroll button, it flips the pages instead of allowing me to just scroll my notes. One thing that you really, really, really have to do pretty early in the game is, if your project is going to involve multiple funding entities, granting organizations, and I'm going to make something up here, it involves a CLG grant, a Cultural Trust Fund grant, and hey, why not a Humanities Council grant? Grants managers need to know how many different systems they're going to have to work with and how they have to document differently for each one of those systems. And they need to be prepared early in the game, not late in the game. So do let them know as soon as you know when you're going to be bringing in this additional funding. Document, 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 document. So you have been successful in getting a grant. Yippee! Round of applause. Congratulations. Now you have to understand how and when the money actually gets into your project and how expenses incurred are paid. And trust me, if this isn't documented every step of the way, you are screwed. I'm going back to that, this is the money is regulated. There's rules. I'm not being poetic here. If the accounting isn't handled correctly, you can lose your grant money. Legally, you can be prosecuted and fined, and your organization's reputation can be ruined. And yes, I'm serious. When you are working within a city or county government, they know this and they are diligent and they have multiple levels of approvals to ensure the money is spent where and when it should be and to the correct people. But they're working off information you have to provide. And I'm going to go back to those few of you that actually do have that separate bank account system. You need to be equally diligent. You can be separately audited. You have as much legal responsibility as a city or a county government has. So I talked about you have to be aware of when the money can come into your system. CLG grants are reimbursement only, which means your local government has to float the costs first. They have to pay that contractor and then seek reimbursement. However, if you got a cultural trust fund grant, we have a different philosophy because we recognize the need for cash flow. And so you could actually request money early in the game prior to expenditures from the cultural trust fund. Still has to be documented how it's spent, but that way you have the cash flow to deal with the timing within the project. One caveat, please, 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 please don't let some board member whip out their personal checkbook to cover an expense. You as the organizational representative in this discussion with me today, and your board member who whipped out the checkbook need to understand that without proper steps being done in the process, they may not get reimbursed. Some things can be done, some things can't. But please don't get in the habit of doing that. It causes nothing but problems for everybody. Document, document, document. Statistics. You, as the organization receiving the grant, your board, you individuals working on the project, not the city or county grants manager or accounting person, is responsible for documenting donated in kind, attendance or participation counts, product counts. If it involves service to a community, how did you document the fact that these services were provided to the community? When? How long? For how many? If your project involves like a survey, how is that information provided to WYSHPO or WYO-TREC? If your project involves a National Register nomination, when are drafts due for review? Are payments tied to completion stages? When is the nomination submitted to WYSHPO for review? Who is responsible for submission? Who is responsible for edits? And I'm going to step back from this presentation and tell you folks, we have all of us have had trouble with contractors. One of the things that has come to bite us on the butt at all levels around here is who's making edits. And so one of the things I'm going to suggest to you all, if you hire a contractor to submit a document to the State Historic Preservation Office, make sure that your timeline and your payments to that contractor include edits after review. Enough said. Document, document, document. Continue. It's not just financial. It's not just statistical. It is also the story. Let's remember, those of us here today are deeply tied to the history of our communities and of our projects. We care about the memories which are reflected within the project that reflect our lives in the community. That history is part of the why that we do this. So don't forget to collect and document the story that goes along with your project. Someone on your board must recognize that there is a story, there's an excitement, there's a reason why you are investing your time and your energy and your local resources and your community to get something done. And you want to get that feedback, you want to get that story, you want to get the excitement from the people or the complaints from the people involved so that you know, how are people responding to this? Why do they care? Why do we care? And people have the memory of what was, and that needs to be, and is that something that needs to be incorporated within what the project is? If you're going to repair or rehabilitate an old building site, a lot of people have interest and memories of that site. Well, do you want to bring that story in there? How are you going to bring that story in? When are you going to share that story? These things are part of the documentation. So you have options in order to share that story with everyone. All grant proposals, I would say 99%, anytime you get dollars from somebody else for your project, there's going to be some sort of reporting process at the end, some sort of final report. For those with formal grant applications, there will be a formal final report. The final report tells you what actually happened. Now, there's differences in intensity level, if you will, on a final report. For example, when you write a CLG grant, a final report is a really quick summary. And the reason it is just a quick summary is we have, within the WYSHPO office, we have all the financial documentation, we have all the details, we've looked at the documents, we've seen the drafts, we know if you've provided the information over into WYOTRAC. So within WYSHPO, we pretty much know what happened with your project through the process that you go through in getting the money from us, in getting the reports filed. Cultural Trust Fund doesn't. So a cultural trust fund final report is much more extensive because the board, my board, the cultural trust fund board, doesn't know your project. They're not seeing those documents coming in. They're not seeing what's been happening to this building. They haven't seen the payments going out because you broke a piece of terracotta and suddenly had to go get that repaired. Okay, we have in WYSHPO, Cultural Trust Fund hasn't. So now in a final report, you're telling us what actually happened, good, bad, indifferent. Things stayed the same. This worked out fine. We proposed this and we did this. Okay, but yeah, we had this problem over here. We had to change this person over here. But anyway, there's a narrative process on a final report. There's also a final financial accounting, whether it's part of the final report or through a final reimbursement process on the CLG side. There's an accounting process that, as somebody who evaluates those final reports, I look at what was proposed and what actually happened. And I need to understand what has changed, if something changed in that. If you have done what you should have been doing with all the other points of this presentation, having people involved, assigned, monitoring, documenting, evaluating, documenting, spending money, documenting, bringing in money, documenting. Okay. Final reports are a snap. Enough said. So, in summary, this has been a brief overview. The first and best advice I can give you is to talk to the representatives of the organizations that you are going to apply for grant dollars for. They can explain what the organization can and cannot support. They can help you with application draft reviews. They answer questions. Talk to them well in advance, because the one thing they don't want you to do, and I never want you to do, please don't do this to yourself, is spend hours preparing a proposal only to discover it is something that they cannot support. So thank you for your time today. Hopefully this will prove to be a useful primer for you, for the attitude you need to take on and the responsibilities that you are taking on when you consider applying for a grant. And I couldn't resist those 3 little volumes on the screen. That's WYSHPO's Bible in giving CLG grant dollars. That comes from the National Park Service. This tells us what can and cannot be supported. We don't make this stuff up when we tell you no. So that's the presentation. I am now going to open this up for any questions that you all may have or anything off the wall. Let's just go ahead and open this up.